Hello, friends. Today I want to talk about what makes something actually Orthodox. This is something that gets discussed a lot, especially on the internet by Orthodox Christians, and particularly around this time of year where I'm recording this here at the end of October, where people think about, can you participate in Halloween? What exactly should we be doing for Christmas, Thanksgiving, all this kind of stuff? The question comes up a lot, like what exactly is an Orthodox Christian supposed to do in these contexts? And I'll tell you right now, by the way, spoiler alert, this video is not about whether or not it's okay to celebrate Halloween. Um, it's an interesting question, but that's not what this is about. But I bring it up as an example. And another related example, for instance, is people ask about yoga, right? Is it okay for an Orthodox Christian to do yoga? And the point of my discussion today is to try to get you to think about all of these questions in a very clear and discerning way and not simply look for quick answers and easy explanations because as we know, that's how the internet normally works, and it's just easier to do that. But if you want to go deeper, if you want to be a discerning Orthodox Christian or discerning Christian, if you're not Orthodox or whoever, I have no idea who's watching and listening to these videos. But if you want to be a discerning person and understand what it really means to be an Orthodox Christian, I'm going to ask you to think and not just accept these quick answers, right? So the first thing I want you to do is set aside the problem of something having a particular label, right? Yoga is a great example of this. And again, I'm not telling anyone they should do yoga or that they can do yoga or I'm recommending, not at all. Not at all. Make no mistake about that, right? I don't do it. I don't recommend that people do it. Right? So just be clear about that. But yoga is a great example because people say yoga is this. Yoga has these origins in Hinduism. The purpose of yoga is A, B, and C. When you do a particular posture, it does this, right? And whenever I hear people talking this way about this or about a lot of other things, Halloween's another example, Christmas is another example, and on and on. Um, I can immediately tell that they've engaged in lazy thinking and they haven't actually even bothered to look some of this stuff up, or maybe they looked it up once and the first answer that they found, that's the thing that they adopted, right? Continuing to use yoga as the example, there are a lot of things that go by the name yoga, things that are ancient and from India, things that are modern that those ancient Indians practicing yoga would not even recognize as being yoga, right? Yoga stretches, pun fully intended, all the way from people literally just doing stretches with no meditation, no breathing exercises, no spiritual overtones or whatever, to people who are actively engaging with specific prayers and are attempting to release their souls from the cycle of reincarnation, right? And lots of stuff in between, and many, 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 many variations. So as a result, there's a whole range of things that all go by this name. Halloween's another good example, right? Halloween, you've got people who are doing things like casting spells to try to control other people, that are putting up ghastly, horrifying decorations on the outside of their houses. But then you also have little kids dressing up and collecting candy in the parking lots of their churches. And both of these sets of things go under the label of Halloween, and there's lots and lots of other practices that also go under that label. When people talk about these things, then they like to put them all under this label and have an answer for it, a quick answer, right? And I mean, people do this to Christmas too, by the way, right? Um, okay, we've got this church celebration called Christmas, but don't you know Christmas trees are pagan? Don't you know that Sol Invictus was this pagan feast that was celebrated around December 25th? Don't you know? And so you put it all together and it's got sort of some kind of cooties that condemns it all, that taints it all, right? And people will use metaphors like, well, if you drink a cup of coffee, but there's one drop of poison in there, or if you eat a package of candy, but there's one poisoned candy in there that'll kill you, right? Um, and It's easy to talk this way because it means I can just sort of be done with the question and I've decided in my head and I have my opinion about it. But I want you to think. I want you to be discerning. I want you to ask the important questions about whatever it is that you come in contact with, whether it's these practices around these holidays or whatever it might be, right? Um, and that's a little harder than just getting thumbs up, thumbs down about something. It's all bad and tainted, or it's fine. I recommend it. Don't worry about it. Or it's neutral. That's not what I'm going for. I'm asking you to think, to use your mind, to use your experience, right? And to ask what exactly makes something orthodox, what exactly makes something okay for an Orthodox Christian to be participating in, to be doing, right? Um, and one of the answers that Orthodox people sometimes give is they'll say, well, this was said by a saint. A saint said this in favor of this or against this, right? And so therefore that's the answer. That's the Orthodox answer. And I mean, that sounds good, right? We should listen to the saints. Absolutely. Absolutely. We should listen to the saints. But I'm going to get to why that can be a problem because of the way that we do that, right? And sometimes people will say, well, this is from inside the Orthodox Church. It came up within the Orthodox context. And so therefore that makes it acceptable and good, right? Or they'll say the opposite thing. Well, this arose from outside the Orthodox community, and so therefore it's unacceptable. It's bad. We can't do that. Only inside the circle are things acceptable, and outside the circle things are unacceptable, right? So this is basically just two different forms of the exact same argument, essentially saying that whatever happens within the Orthodox community is acceptable, and whatever is outside of it, it should be rejected. This is also a problematic approach. And I'll just give you a couple examples of things that are from inside the Orthodox community that eventually the church rejected, right? So, I mean, you can argue about this, but there are Orthodox people, certainly now, and maybe in the past, although that is very debatable, maybe even some saints, although again, that is very debatable, who believed in the doctrine of universalism, this idea that everyone will be saved, no matter what, right? With all kinds of variation on how we get there. The church rejects this, right? In the ecumenical councils, it rejects this. I know that some people like to argue over those ecumenical councils. Well, Justinian kind of slipped in some stuff later on. I don't care if he slipped in stuff later on because the church has received it as being a rejection of universalism as a heresy, right? The church received it that way. The church received those elements as belonging to that council, even if they didn't actually happen when those bishops were meeting together. It doesn't matter if it happened when those bishops were meeting together, right? But the point I'm making here is not to debate this question of universalism, which is a condemned heresy, not to debate that, but to make the point that just because something happens within the context of the church does not mean that it is acceptable for Orthodox Christians. Indeed, all of the heresies that the church has rejected happen within the context of the church, right? No one gets anathematized at an ecumenical council who wasn't already an Orthodox Christian, right? So it comes from within the church. Another example, this is probably a bit easier one, and one that's maybe a lot of people have never heard of, is something called Syncorocartia, which existed for a few centuries, particularly around and after the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople. And if you've never heard of this, then thank God, because it means that it's gone now. But what it was is actually sort of an Orthodox version of indulgences. So you could buy documents. You could buy documents from patriarchs and bishops that said, actually, not that you had indulgences, because of course the Orthodox Church doesn't teach indulgences, but they said that your sins were forgiven. You could buy forgiveness of your sins. You could buy documents that said that you were forgiven of your sins. This is actually, I think, worse than selling indulgences, right? Uh, And it should be immediately clear to anyone listening to me that this is not consistent with the Orthodox faith. So even though this existed for centuries, and I actually heard of some instances that even it lasted up until maybe the late 19th, early 20th century, very recent from an Orthodox point of view, the church rejects this. Again, it arose within the church. It arose within the church, and yet the church rejected it. So this shows, I could give lots of other examples, lots of other examples. This shows that just because something comes from within the Orthodox community does not mean that it is Orthodox. It does not mean that it is acceptable for Orthodox Christians. And sometimes it lasts a really long time. Eventually, the church rejects it. There could be things like that right now, right now within the Orthodox world that they exist now, but eventually the church is going to reject it. Maybe not in our lifetimes. Maybe it'll be long after I'm dead and maybe most of you are dead. Right. So things come up that are not really consistent with our faith. Um, on the other side, people will sometimes say, well, that's from outside the Orthodox Church, and so therefore it is bad, right? We have to reject it or at best ignore it. Um, but here's the thing: is there are things that are um, actually very, very part of Orthodox tradition that the origins of the particular expression or shape or term or image or whatever is from outside the Orthodox context, outside of the context of the people of God. And I'll give you a few examples. And these are all from the scriptures, actually, right? So unassailable examples. Um, One example, for instance, is that Christ in I think it's in the book of Malachi, if I'm remembering correctly, is called the Son of Righteousness. Son, S-U-N, the Son of Righteousness, who rises with healing in his wings. Well, this phrase, Son of Righteousness, in Hebrew is Shemesh Tzedakah, which is the name of the sun god who was worshipped in the city of Jerusalem before Israel conquered Jerusalem. Shemesh Tzedakah, which literally means Son of Righteousness. Right? So this language, this title for a pagan god gets applied to the Son of God, to Jesus. It is straight out of paganism, right? Another example is that in Daniel chapter 7, the Son of Man comes riding on the clouds when he's in this great enthronement scene, when he's enthroned next to the Ancient of Days. And of course, we also see in the Gospels, it says that Jesus is going to come on the clouds, coming with the clouds. Well, this cloud riding imagery is straight out of Canaanite Baal worship. So Baal, this awful, terrible god of the Canaanites, this thunder god, he's called the cloud rider, right? This is straight out of Baal mythology. And yet this language of the cloud rider, which would have been known, very, very known to ancient Israel, gets taken and applied once again to Jesus Christ, to the Son of God, to the Son of Man himself. And I'll give just one more example that's in the Bible. And this is something that is extremely central for us. And that's the word gospel, which in Greek is evangelion. Now, most of the time, people think of it in terms of the literal translation of the parts of the word, meaning good news. But this term actually predates Jesus. It predates the apostles. And it referred to the announcement by a general or some other conqueror that he had won a victory. So it came in the context not just of pagans, but of pagans who are going around conquering people, right? And this announcement of a victory, this specific language, and not just the term itself, by the way, but the shape of it, which included three things: who's the conqueror, what did he do, and what does he expect of everyone? These things are used by Jesus, by the apostles. These are pagan terms. They arose outside of the people of God, absolutely, and yet they are now central. Especially this concept of a gospel is utterly central to Christianity, utterly central. And of course, Jesus is the cloud rider that appears in icons of the Ascension. It's just there. You can't get away from it. And the Son of Righteousness language, that's not just in Malachi, it's also in our hymns. This is used around nativity to refer to Jesus when he's born. So these things arose outside, and the church said, we're going to take that. We're going to use that, right? So I want to talk about authority for a second because this is a really, really important concept in Christian tradition. And I think in a lot of ways that modern people, especially modern Orthodox people talking on the internet, we misuse and misunderstand probably most of the time the idea of authority in the Orthodox Church. So when speaking about authority, of course, we begin with Christ and the authority that he has, the authority that he takes back to himself as he's about to ascend into heaven. As he said, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Go therefore. So he sends the apostles out. He delegates to them some of this authority. And so this is where we have the concept of apostolic succession. And we have bishops, right, who are successors of the apostles. And they are the people that are part of the church community here in this life that we are to be obedient to. Now, it's interesting that a lot of people, they love the idea of authority within the church, and yet when a bishop says something that they disagree with, he has no authority to that, right? It's funny. I sometimes joke that in Orthodoxy on the internet, everyone is a bishop except the bishops. They don't have any authority, and yet they do. They do. There's no getting around that. I mean, I think, for instance, about the very strong language of Saint Ignatius of Antioch, where he says, um, "Anyone who does anything apart from the bishop is a worshiper of the devil." That's pretty strong language. Um, yeah, I don't usually put that into sermons, but you can see what he means, and you can't get away from the fact that bishops have authority within the Orthodox Church. But that authority is not absolute. Bishops don't have the authority to alter the Orthodox faith. They don't have the authority to tell us to sin, right? They don't have that authority. Um, no one does. No one can do that, right? Now, does that mean that it is my job to judge them and to determine for myself what the Orthodox faith is and how and when an Orthodox bishop is aligning according to what I think he should be doing? No, it does not mean that. It does not mean that. But if it's a question of authority between me and my bishop, it's the bishop who wins because he's the one who actually has the authority, not me. Now, if I disagree with him in a profound way, let's say my bishop tells me to sin, then what I have to do, since I can't sin, I'm not supposed to sin, is say, know your eminence, know your grace, and then accept whatever consequences come. And for me as a priest, that could be deposition. I could be defrocked. I could be removed from the priesthood, and accept that. That's the example of the saints, right? When they have to disagree with their bishop in a way that is going to come to a head like that, then they accept the consequences. They don't complain forever about whatever happened to them, like they're being martyred or whatever. Maybe they are being martyred, but they don't complain about it. The martyrs don't complain about being martyred. Why are you doing this to me? Right? Indeed, actually, they look upon it generally as a blessing from God to be martyred. That's just the way that it is. Um, a lot of times people will say things like, the bishops can be a problem, so we need to follow the saints, right? This is a good thought, but the way that it gets applied now has some problems with it. And let's just take some of those apart, right? When they say follow the saints, that could mean a lot of different things. It might mean, for instance, I read somewhere one of the church fathers said this, therefore that is my opinion. Well, a lot of times people take that stuff out of context and they're not reading what it is that father is talking about. And there's also a pretty big piece of context, which is almost never is that church father talking to them, right? They're not the audience. They're not the intended audience. And so that can lead to a lot of misreadings. This is why, for instance, some people misread some of the church fathers and therefore walk away with the heretical doctrine of universalism, right? Because they're like, well, one of the church fathers said it, therefore it's authoritative. A saint said this, therefore it's authoritative, right? Um, and this especially happens particularly here in the modern era when you're talking about modern saints and modern problems. People find that a saint said something to someone at one point. And I should mention, by the way, that not every quote from a saint that gets passed around the internet is authentic. Sometimes stuff gets repeated that they never said. I mean, this is a huge problem of misattributed or unattributed quotations or whatever. Sometimes they're just completely made up. Right? This is a huge problem. But let's say it could be, let's say we have a recording. We know that the saint said this in this particular context, whatever. So there's a lot of things that we need to unpack with that. Was the saint talking to me? Was the saint speaking generally to all of humanity, generally to the whole church? Almost never is that true. Almost never. So there's already a decontextualization happening when we take that saint's words out of the context in which he spoke them or she spoke them, because we have a lot of female saints as well speaking now. We take it out of that context and want to make it apply to another situation, to another person, whatever. Now, sometimes you can do that and it works, but a lot of times you can't do that because it doesn't work. But also, there is the issue, and this is a real issue, that saints speaking within their context are also speaking according to the best of their knowledge. Because there are some sayings from saints, and again, sometimes it's hard to know whether these are authentic. There are some sayings which indicate a certain degree of ignorance sometimes on the part of the saint. Saints are not omniscient. Saints are not omniscient. But it doesn't matter. They don't need to be. What it is that they say needs to be heard by the person that they're talking to, right? Even if the saint is getting some fact wrong or they don't understand something correctly, the thing that that person in front of them needs to hear is the thing that that saint is saying. But sometimes they misunderstand. Sometimes they're ignorant of things. It's true. It really is true. That's because they're human, just like all of us, right? They're not omniscient. No saint is omniscient. No saint knows everything, gets everything exactly right. I mean, this is this is one of the classic criticisms that Orthodox Christians often make of papal infallibility. Is they say no one is infallible, and yet we say that, and yet sometimes then we treat some saints, especially modern ones, uh, that way. Like, oh, well, we don't believe in infallibility for the Pope, but I believe in infallibility for this particular saint that lived, this time. Um, I'm sorry, you can't have your cake and eat it too, right? Uh, it seems to me that saints who live, decades and say lots and lots of things, not everything that they say is going to be something that is going to stand the test of time and is needed by the church long term. Not everything that they say, right? And that's okay. That's how this thing works. There is a process of reception that has to go on. The church receives things. And with modern saints, often there's this reception, this sifting and so forth has not happened. And it's a new challenge in a lot of ways for us of how that works, because we have recording devices and all kinds of things. We have way more quotes from modern saints in many cases than we do from ones from centuries and centuries ago, because people are writing things down. There's recordings and whatever, right? So there's a lot going on now that makes this a new challenge in some way. And so there is this process of reception. And the way that the church functions in this is slowly, carefully, deliberately, prudently, right? That's how it goes. So these are some of the difficulties in dealing with this question of authority and this question of saints, especially modern saints. And then I'll add one extra layer of problem to this, right? Which is sometimes you get people say we need to follow the saints because the bishops are bad, right? The bishops are wrong, so only listen to the saints. What about the fact that these saints are being canonized by the bishops? What about that? You ever think about that? Yes, popular veneration, yes, all that kind of stuff, but it takes bishops to actually make the decision to put a particular person into the canon of saints and approve public veneration, approve feast days, whatever. So that means that even our ability to identify who is a saint depends on the authority of people that we might be sitting in judgment of, the authority of people that we might be questioning, right? And I actually know, I'm not going to say the name here, but there is someone, and God bless this person. I believe that this person is probably mentally ill, but there is a person I know who rejects modern saints. Like he rejects St. Paisius. He rejects St. John Maximovich. He rejects modern saints. He rejects St. Silouan. He rejects modern saints because he does not trust, does not believe in, does not want to follow the bishops who have lived in the 20th century, that they're all traitors and so forth. And so he very consistently then rejects these canonizations, you know? Um, so yeah, who is a saint? And especially if you're going to ask the question of like um, who's authoritative and living right now, who's speaking right now, living people are not canonized. They're not canonized. So does that mean that we should never listen to anyone who's currently alive and only wait until they're dead and canonized? You see the problem with this? It sounds simple to say just follow the saints, but it's not that simple when you use it that way, right? You come up with a lot of problems. You end up picking the voices that you want to agree with and ignoring other voices, right? It's a picking and choosing. That means that the process of reception is unavoidable. So then the question is, who is doing the receiving? Me personally? Am I just the one doing the receiving? And I'm deciding, which holy people I want to listen to? If so, then I have a problem because I've made myself the judge of what it means to be an Orthodox Christian, right? I've made myself the judge. This is a problem. All of this together, I describe as on the one side, it creates formal criteria, like it creates criteria for what you can consider Orthodox and what you cannot consider Orthodox, right? What goes in the bucket, what's thrown out of the bucket, and whether it happens within the context of the church community, whether it happens because a saint said it or whatever, right? And on the other hand, you've got this kind of, I like to call it cooties approach to things that people want to reject. Like, well, it has the cooties from being outside of the church. It has the cooties of not ever having been approved by a saint. Sometimes you see people on the internet that say, no saint ever did X, Y, and Z. And I like to say, well, no saint ever left comments on YouTube, as far as we know. No saint ever argued theology on the internet. So why are we doing it? Right? You can see it's a ridiculous thing to say. No saint ever, whatever. I mean, come on. Yeah, that's just ridiculous. There was a point when something was new, and there was a point when a saint did it for the first time, or maybe no saint ever did it, but that doesn't mean that it must be rejected. And the problem with this sort of formal criteria, like looking for an authority, looking for some kind of label to attach so I can say stamped, approved, is that it doesn't ask the question about whatever is under consideration, whether that thing is consistent with the Orthodox faith. Because remember, there are things that could have had that stamp of approval and that did have that stamp of approval, sometimes for centuries, and that eventually were rejected. Why? Because they were not consistent with the Orthodox faith. Because they were not consistent with the Orthodox faith. In other words, the formal criterion didn't solve the problem. You need to look at the content. What is the actual content? Don't just look on the surface. Don't just look at what has approval. Look at the content. What is the actual content of the thing? Is it consistent with the Orthodox faith? I'm going to talk in a second about exactly how you know that. But I want to extend this problem to show how this is alive and well right now within the Orthodox Church. People using this formal approach, the approach of formal criteria, to justify all kinds of stuff, right? And to reject other things. So a good example, for instance, is, and I'm not trying to take a side in this particular debate, so don't misunderstand me, but a good example is Western Rite liturgical practices in the Orthodox Church. And I'll just say outright that I have multiple friends who are priests and some laymen who serve in the Western Rite. My personal experience of the Western Rite has been very, very positive. But there are certain practices that Western Rite parishes do that are controversial, sometimes within the Western Rite communities, and then of course outside of the Western Rite communities. In fact, the very existence of the Western Rite is controversial for a lot of people, right? People talk about this a lot. It's interesting how much it gets talked about, considering how really truly small the representation of the Western Rite in the Orthodox Church is. But nonetheless, that's where it is. And often people have this debate, specifically by using formal criteria. They'll say, well, that practice did not exist at this point in church history before the Great Schism with Rome, and so therefore it's not Orthodox. Or I've seen people say, on the other hand, well, there was some kind of communion going on even into the 13th century, and there was even some kind of intercommunion in certain places going on for centuries after, and therefore that means that the practices of the Church of Rome at that time were Orthodox practices because we were in communion with that. Now, I think you can see the problem with that based on everything that I just said, right? This is about trying to find formal criteria. Again, Sincoro Cartia, the purchasable forgiveness certificates happened within the heart of the Orthodox Church. I mean, you could buy them from the ecumenical patriarch, you know. In the Ottoman period, it's probably not wrong to say that that was sort of the heart of the Orthodox Church in terms of the community and whatever. Although Orthodoxy has always existed outside of that, and we should not think that the history of the Roman Empire and its subsequent cultural traditions and expressions equals the history of the Orthodox Church. That has never been true. Never, ever, ever been true. But nonetheless, you could buy a Sincoro, I'm not sure what the singular is. You could buy one of these certificates from the first among equals himself. And yet the church eventually rejected it, right? So the formal criterion did not work to guarantee the orthodoxy of something, you know? And so when we're thinking about liturgical practices, we can't just simply say, well, did this exist at some point in church history within this circle that I'm going to say is approved? Because frankly, there's a lot of things that they were new at some point. There was no precedent for them at some point, or at least, the change that they wanted to make, whatever. And there are things that are now beloved in many Orthodox traditions. I'll give you an example, like the practice of the moleben, which is very, very common amongst the Russian and other Slavic Orthodox traditions. A moleben, which, if you look at it closely, is basically a truncated version of matins with some other stuff kind of mixed into it. On the Greek, Antiochian, etc. side, you've got the paraklesis. Again, another sort of version of matins. They take the matin service and they made some changes to it. There was a point in history where those things were new. There was a point in history in which no Orthodox Christian had ever done them before. It was new. It was new. You couldn't find a place to say, well, this satisfies this formal criterion because it existed at this point, right? Another example, for instance, is akathists. Once upon a time, there was just simply the akathist, which was actually a particular long kondakion, because a kondakion was a much, much longer kind of hymn in the earlier years of the church. And the akathist is one kondakion, right? But then later on, you get all kinds of new akathists being written. Again, this is particularly within the Russian tradition for devotional purposes and all kinds of things, right? That represented a change. That represented an innovation within the church. Something that there was no precedent for, but these changes were made, right? Another thing, I remember when I first became Orthodox in the 1990s, and then on for the next 10, 15 years or so, you don't see it as much anymore, but once in a while I still run across it. People love, love, love to debate the way that clergy should dress and groom themselves. Should we wear cassocks or collars or both? Should we have long beards, long hair, no beards, short hair? Some of us, like if I wanted to have long hair, I couldn't even really do it now. A long time ago, I actually did have long hair, but all of these things, people love to debate this stuff and they'll say, this is Orthodox, this is not Orthodox, because they have this image in their mind and it has to conform to that image. And maybe they even found some canon saying, clergy should dress like clergy, which actually it doesn't define exactly what that means, by the way. There's a lot of ignorance surrounding this particular issue because, for instance, there are canons that say that monks should have short hair because long hair at that time and place was regarded as being ostentatious. Now, of course, it's normal for monks to have long hair. It goes exactly the opposite direction. Um, some people will say, well, priests should have long hair and they must have long beards. They can't cut these things. They have to just let them grow and grow and grow. And I I like to show them an icon of St. John Chrysostom. If you don't know what I mean, go Google his image right now. St. John Chrysostom is never depicted with long hair or a long beard. I don't know whether he could have grown his hair out long, but he probably could have grown his beard out longer, but he's never depicted with either one of those things, right? Never. A clergy collar. It's like I don't wear a clergy collar, but there are pictures of Saint Raphael of Brooklyn wearing a clergy collar and a suit and trimmed beard and short hair. That's a saint. Does that mean look, a saint did it? Satisfies that criterion, right? Look, a saint did it. A saint said this. Does that mean that we should all do that? Or that we should, or that he was not really a saint? I mean, it goes on and on and on. You know, people looking for formal criteria for things, and especially looking to external stuff as the definition of what it really means to be Orthodox, how you can understand something as being truly Orthodox. This is the wrong spirit. It really is. And honestly, it's lazy. It's lazy, folks. It's lazy, right? So how do you determine whether something is Orthodox or compatible with Orthodoxy or a matter of choice? There's enough variety within the Orthodox Church that it's clear that there's not just one thing that represents the authentic Orthodox Christian life. Lots of different kinds of music, different kinds of vestments, different kinds of church architecture. All of these things are all variables, and yet people can have very, very strong opinions about them. And that's not just here in 2024. It gets even more variable if you look at the whole history of the church, right? So how do you know if something is truly Orthodox or at least compatible with Orthodoxy? Because I'm not going to say, for instance, the brand of toothpaste that I use is Orthodox, but I would say it's compatible with my Orthodox Christian life. There's nothing unorthodox about it. Who cares what brand of toothpaste I use? Just most people care that I use it at all. But how do you know that something is Orthodox or compatible with the Orthodox faith? The first question, especially if you're new, and let's be honest, a lot of people talking about Orthodox Christianity on the internet are new. They are what the apostles call neophytes. They're new. The first question is, am I being obedient to the God-given authority of my church? I know that's uncomfortable, especially for Americans. We don't like obedience. We don't like it. Our country was not founded that way. It was founded with the opposite, honestly. Right? We don't like obedience. We obey only ourselves, right? Am I being obedient to the God-given authority over me? Scripture says we should. The saints say we should, right? It's bolstered everywhere in the Orthodox tradition. It's really, really there. You don't have to go looking for this. You don't. If you're going to decide not to do it, that means you're ignoring a huge amount of Orthodox tradition to say, no, I don't need to be obedient. That is not Orthodox, to just reject obedience or to question it every single time. Like if I have to question every single decision my bishop makes or every single command that he gives me, that is not obedience. It's not obedience when I only follow my own will. It's just not. Okay? It's not, right? Am I being obedient? And more broadly, not just obedience to the bishops, but obedience to and harmony with the whole of the Orthodox tradition. The whole of the Orthodox tradition. That especially means the scriptures, but it also means a lot of other things as well, right? Decisions of the ecumenical councils, the writings of the church fathers, liturgical services. But it also means harmony with my community, with my parish community. Am I in harmony with them? Am I living the life together with them? That doesn't mean that every single person in that community is going to be doing exactly the same things, but it does mean that we're doing this together and we're in harmony with each other. Okay? There's not, Orthodox Christianity is not something that's just me and Jesus or me and the ecumenical councils or whatever. It's not. It's just not, right? It's in harmony with the community. So if what I want to do is damaging the harmony of my community, damaging the unity of the church, I have a problem. I am a problem if that's what I'm doing. That's not how this works. That's not the way that the Orthodox Christian tradition works. And so then finally, I think the biggest issue in determining how to do this, how to be obedient to our bishops, how to be in harmony with the whole of the tradition, harmony with the whole of my community, this is something for which there is no shortcut. And that is this question: am I formed in the Orthodox life? Am I being formed in the Orthodox life? And I'm going to say this very directly. If you're new, if you're an inquirer, if you're a catechumen, if you've been recently baptized, recently chrismated, just in the past few years, just the past few months, you are not formed yet. You're just not. I'm sorry. You're just not. It's going to take some time and experience, and there's no shortcuts for this. It doesn't matter how many books you read. It doesn't matter how many edifying YouTube videos you consume. It doesn't matter how many podcasts you listen to. There is no shortcut for experience. There's just not. And so if you're inexperienced, and a lot of us are, if you're inexperienced, then the main thing to do is to simply be obedient, even if it doesn't make sense to you. If you are being obedient the best that you know how, and you make a mistake because the person who's leading you has made a mistake or maybe is bad, if you are being obedient, God will honor your obedience. He will honor your obedience and he will count it to you as righteousness. It is a righteous act to be obedient, even if the person who is giving you commands is way off. But let's face it, most of them just aren't. Right? We love to pay attention to the weird stuff, the problem stuff, the controversial stuff. But day to day, your average parish priest is guiding you well, the best that he can, as he himself is humbly submitting to his bishop and humbly trying to repent and to struggle forward in his salvation with his wife and kids. Most of the time, they're doing their job. It's true. Most of the time, they're doing their job. They're not sitting there, twisting their mustache and hatching evil plans to lead you into hell and collaborating with the federal government and, receiving instructions from the Illuminati or whatever else. They're not doing that, right? Most of the time, they're just doing their jobs. And also, let's face it, the Orthodox tradition is big enough that even if one particular clergyman is off, he doesn't throw off the whole thing. He doesn't. Even when he's a very powerful, very visible, very famous clergyman. It maybe causes a lot of problems, but he can't throw off the whole thing because this is bigger than all of us, bigger than any patriarch, bigger than any bishop, bigger than any parish priest, right? And so, especially if you're unformed, and those of you who are formed probably know this already, the main thing is just to live the life, just to live the life. And as you live the life, as you get that experience, as you learn not just in your head, but truly in your heart, how to be an Orthodox Christian, then when you encounter something, you're going to know whether it's actually consistent with the Orthodox faith, because you're going to know that the content of it, not just the formal criteria. Formal criteria can be important, but they're not really the big question. Whether the content of it is good and expresses the Orthodox faith, or it's compatible with the Orthodox faith. This is why there can be innovation and creativity within the church. And sometimes that innovation and creativity means adopting and adapting things that have their origins outside of the church community. But it's not just about adopting them, it's about adapting them as well. I gave some examples of that already. These things happen. We need to not be so quick to just throw out condemnations or stamps of approval on something because it fits some criteria in our head. That's not how it works. And particularly if you're new, if you've only been Orthodox for a few years or you're just looking in the window, forgive me for saying this, but your opinion doesn't really matter. It doesn't. right? Like my opinion only matters within the context of the context in which it matters, right? So, which means that ultimately, because my context in which my opinion matters are small, ultimately my opinion doesn't matter either. So I'm not saying that like I'm special or whatever. I have particular duties as a priest and as a teacher and so forth, right? Um, but as I say every so often, if you're just listening to me on the internet, you're not responsible to me. I'm not your spiritual father. I'm not your pastor. I'm not your priest. I'm definitely not your bishop. I'm not your dad. You know, you don't have to listen to me. And so everything that I say, you should receive in this manner. You should ask yourself, is this consistent with what my community is doing? Is this consistent with what my spiritual father, my father confessor is telling me? Is this consistent with that? Is it helping me with that? If it is, thank God. If it's not, please ignore me. Really, ignore me. Pray for me. Pray for me, please. So, uh, to conclude all of this, to summarize all of this, um, what I urge you is to look at the content of a thing and ask whether that is consistent with or compatible with the Orthodox Christian faith. And don't just say it has this label or I think it has this origin or whatever and say that's good or that's bad, period. Right? Think, use your mind. God gave you that. God gave you your mind. And particularly if you're new, the main place your mind should be going is this in obedience to my confessor, to my pastor, to my bishop, in harmony with my community? If you simply do that for the rest of your life, you're on the right road. You're on the right road. Thanks for listening to me this time around. God bless you all, and pray for me.